What's up, everybody? It's Reggie Williams, founder and CEO of Ambrosia for Heads. And with me, I have Jake Payne, our editor in chief. And together, this is our What's the Headline podcast. What's going on, man?
Yo, man, I look forward to this episode. This is our second year in a row doing it. And man, I've always, you and I've talked about it. I always kind of like those opportunities to look back at the year that is, the year that was, and really kind of understand what its themes are and celebrate some of its great music. So, man, I've been looking forward to this as much as any episode we've done in a while.
Yeah, I agree, man. There's always arcs that you don't recognize. It's a chance to go back and listen to great music. I've listened to a bunch of albums this week, and man, it was a really great year for hip hop. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. But, usually what Jake and I do is we'll go through and kind of create like top 10, top 20 lists for different things. It's been, typically albums every year, sometimes songs, sometimes freestyles. This has been actually, I think, a relatively quiet year for freestyles when I think about it. But this year, we're going to do something different. We're going to really talk about the events that occurred, like really try and encapsulate the year in hip hop that was news. So we're going to talk about that from a few different ways. We're going to discuss it in terms of traffic, because often that tells a very different story than what kind of cultural impact does. We will talk about cultural impact. We'll talk about things that popped up in the podcast that didn't necessarily, that had a different impact via podcast than did via the site, and try and make it interesting. But it's been a real cool year and looking forward to discussing it. So you ready to get into it?
Yeah, man, let's do it. So, I like beginning with impact. Like you just said, that tells a very different story sometimes than numbers. And I also think that echoes kind of the ethos of Ambrosia for Heads. We've always believed that numbers are helpful and we like to listen to them and treat them with all due respect. But you and I, so many times, the stories that excite us, the stories that we make personal sacrifices in our lives to report on, to tell, to really present, aren't always going to be reflected in the numbers. And, this year, I think there's some nice overlap, but it's fitting to start with that impact. So I'm going to kick it off to you, man. Tell us, and for anyone listening too, we or watching, we're doing this in reverse order, kind of a ranking to the top. So you can kind of guess and listen along, play along with us.
Absolutely. So, what you said about the numbers not capturing everything, I think is a great segue into the first kind of moment. And in some ways, this was the year of the dragon. Busta Rhymes, the Dungeon Dragon, was, in our opinion, the person who dropped the best album of 2020. And you and I know that the Grammys came out recently reflecting that output, and his album would have qualified for 2021 because of the window that he did. And he was overlooked. I think it was a classic album. I would say that it's probably Busta's best album in his catalog. I think it was in many ways a comeback album, not to say that he's been anywhere, but it was at a magnitude and quality level that was different than anything that we've heard from him in quite a while. And that was shamefully ignored, but he had a mic drop moment in September, or actually late August, which I think reminded everyone of just what an incredible world-class performer this guy is. And you're the one who wrote the story and created the image, which I think just perfectly captured it. But you want to talk about it?
Yeah, and one quick addendum, just because I love the fact that people are listening. I mean, you and I started this in March of 2020, when we kind of made a pivot from the site. But we started this podcast, What's the Headline? And a lot of people have been listening every week. Last year, when we closed out the year, I said Royce the 5'9's Allegory was my album of 2020. But make no mistake, Busta Rhymes ELE2 is definitely in my top 3 last year. And I would contend to say it's his best album. Hands down, he made a classic album 30 years into his career, which was the headline you came up with. But getting to what you just said, full disclosure, whether it's the Grammy Awards or the VMAs or the Billboard Awards, BET Awards, performances don't always move me anymore. Oftentimes, I think they veer very much into audience reaction shots and just kind of medleys of hits that just feel very cut and dry to me. And the VMAs this year, I didn't expect much from. I think that what they consider to be hip hop, if Kendrick Lamar or J. Cole isn't performing, you know, it's probably not our, as a hip hop community, venue. And then I watched this Busta Rhymes performance and it blew me away. I mean, one of the things that we covered in 2020, along with Busta making a classic album, is his health journey, his fitness journey. You know, Busta dropped a lot of weight. He damn nearly died because of a condition, you know, in his throat, and he was sleeping close to a fan. We've watched a lot of, you know, hip hop legends pass away for various causes. And Busta really took his health, smoking cigarettes, things like that, into his account. And it showed in this performance. I think that if you were to go to, like, you know, 95 to 2002, maybe 2005, Busta was an elite performer. The energy, the delivery, the choreography. And, you know, here we are, you know, 15 years past that, and he's bringing that same energy. And he wore a leather suit, kind of looking like Just Ice, you know, from like 88, like leather, red. And he had Spliff Star with him, you know, kept it classic, and he tore it down. But to your point, the interesting thing to me was, you know, Busta Rhymes has never won a VMA, but yet he gives the stage, which happened to be at the Barclays Center. And Busta Rhymes, you know, reps Brooklyn as well as Long Island. He gave it his all. And it was almost like, you know, an FU to award shows. And I know we talk about that a lot with the Grammys, but it was like Busta left it all on the table. And that suddenly became the angle. It was more than just like, hey, Busta Rhymes performs his hits at the VMA. It became something, you know, far deeper. Busta Rhymes' VMA performance is a drop the mic moment, because at the very end of the performance, Busta drops the mic, you know, like Obama out. And we captured that. And it's fun to do that here and there when it's warranted. And this was absolutely warranted of Busta dropping the mic.
Word. And, you know, it's just a reminder, like, he was such a visual icon. The videos, I think he and Missy together really kind of revolutionized video. A lot of that was Hype Williams. I think that it was also a reminder of the joints that he has. He's just got incredible songs and hits. And, you know, he's had a really incredible year. Like, I think he basked in the glory of that album. It dropped, I think, in like December, late November, December. And it held for like several months. We had it, you know, deep on our playlist for a long time. People were talking about it. And then he got reinvigorated by, you know, just his long affiliation with Dr. Dre. You know, Dre recently dropped a project, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but Busta's on that too. And it's a reminder of the great music I'm sure those dudes have in the chamber. You know, we only got a little bit, a taste, but I bet you they've got 20, 30 songs. And so I think it was a great year for Busta, and a great moment for hip hop for sure. Yeah. So next up is, you know, something that we just alluded to. Like, so hip hop cemented its mainstream legacy. So Time Magazine, I think, was back in 1999. It's either 99 or 2000. Had a cover with Lauryn Hill on it, and it said Hip Hop Nation. So you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I forgot about that.
Yeah. And, you know, for people in hip hop, it was like, okay, you're like 10 years late on that, first of all, because hip hop, it's been a hip hop nation for a long time now. But it was, you know, kind of the mainstream acknowledgement of the culture of hip hop's kind of overtaking mainstream culture. Now, fast forward 20 years later, and we're starting to see that being cemented through, you know, really, you know, reflecting an almost like Hall of Fame level celebration of moments in time that are related to hip hop. I was just at a restaurant recently in New York. Oh, you know, by the way, just one last thing on Busta. So I went to see Dave Chappelle. He did his documentary premiere at Barclays in early November or mid-November, something like that. And he had a bunch of people perform. Rakim performed, her, but Busta came out and absolutely shut it down. It was just like that VMAs. The whole energy changed in the building. Everyone got up, and it was after like 4 or 5 hours of entertainment. Like, people were tired. But you know, Busta like had everybody on their feet, and it just really, really showed you what an incredible performer he is. But in any case, so going back to hip hop and its mainstream legacy, there are a couple things that happened this year that I don't think even in 2000 with Hip Hop Nation covers on Time Magazine we could have imagined. So one is the Super Bowl halftime. We get and this just blew me away. It almost seemed like a rumor on Twitter or something like that. But that hip hop, the halftime show was going to be Dr. Dre, and it's basically like his family. So it's Snoop Dogg, Eminem, Kendrick Lamar, and Mary J. Blige. And Mary, obviously doing Family Affair with him, is a part of that. But it seems like a celebration not only of hip hop but of Dr. Dre himself. And we covered that. So, what were your thoughts when that first broke?
You know, I'll admit my faults. When that first happened, I wasn't as excited by it as you were. And I believe you texted me. I mean, and it wasn't even necessarily a nudge that this was something worthy of the site. It was just like you were really excited by it. And then in time, I saw the excitement of our readers. And I believe it. And it totally makes sense. I mean, Dr. Dre is somebody that, you know, my mom knows who he is. My father knows who he is. He transcends, and, you know, he has hit records. He's been around for 35 plus years in various iterations. He also, you know, especially 5 years ago, had a piece of electronics that became an accessory. Like, you knew it was like Guess jeans or, you know, a certain bag or jacket. Like, people knew his name based on those headphones design. And that's never quite translated in the way that it should. And I think that this is a huge affirmation. And now, I mean, that news broke either at the end of September or early October. And now we see that was, you know, a bookend or a milestone checkpoint. And Dre has already since then filled it with things building up to it, including new music, which is always what I care about most when it comes to Dre.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we've discussed this, but there's someone in the background who had a pretty strong hand in this, and that's Jay-Z. You know, Jay-Z formed a partnership with the NFL 2 years ago in the midst of the Colin Kaepernick controversy. He took a lot of heat over that. A lot of people thought he was selling out. Jay himself reportedly had actually turned down a Super Bowl halftime performance that year. It was filled by Maroon 5, and then Big Boy and Travis Scott joined as well. But since then, Jay has done a lot of things to really be, influential in how the NFL moves. So this is obvious one. They ultimately settled with Colin Kaepernick, which is good. There've been a lot of community service activities, but this one was a major statement. And, I think Jay is another part of how hip hop's mainstream legacy has been cemented. Earlier this year, he and LL Cool J were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And we've talked about it many times, don't need to go deep into it, but there's always been a conflicted legacy with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and hip hop. It's called the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There's not very much inclusion of hip hop or any other genre in that name, but it has de facto become the Music Hall of Fame. So to have these guys in it, I think is a big deal. And they're certainly not the first rap artist to be in it, right? There's Public Enemy, NWA,
Furious Five, Run DMC.
Yeah, there've been quite a few people, but we've never seen it take over the celebration to this extent. So LL has Dr. Dre come out and induct him, and Dre does like an 8-minute speech, and he's
the most I've ever heard Dre talk outside of Defiant Ones.
He's happy. He's engaged. It seems like it's from the heart. It's not overly scripted. Like, he is really talking about the love that he has for this man. And you can tell because when you step back and think about it, Dr. Dre came of prominence in, say, 87, 88, the Easy E album, Easy Does It, comes out straight out of Compton. It's like around 88, 89. And so, when he was aspiring to get big and was a DJ in clubs and stuff like that, guess who was running the radio? Literally, LL Cool J. So it makes sense that LL Cool J is more than just a musical like partner to him. He's an inspiration. He's an icon to him. So he gets to induct his big homie in some ways into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And you can just see him gushing. And that was a true, incredible hip hop moment. He brings out Eminem. They perform Rock the Bells. Like, it's incredible. And that would be enough, right? But it doesn't end there. So Jay-Z gets inducted, and he's inducted by Dave Chappelle, who we talked about earlier, but then also POTUS, number 44. And 44 is like, so prominent in Jay's legacy. Barack Obama comes out. and or actually does a video, but how many times do you see a president celebrating an artist in that kind of mainstream form? But that's not enough either. He has a video where literally like 40 stars from Lin-Manuel to Beyonce to like everyone you can think of celebrating him and inducting him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And then he gets on stage and does a drop the mic speech too. So overall, hip hop took up about 40 minutes of this year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and did it in the biggest of ways.
You know, for years, I've been talking to hip hop artists that have often been envious of the way that the rock and roll community like creates this element of classic rock, you know, of the Who or the Rolling Stones or Led Zeppelin, or pick anyone, you know, 3 or 4 rungs down, can go out on tour. They're constantly on radio. They build a culture around itself. And I think that in 2021, we've gotten to a whole new level of building a culture around our legends. And Dre and LL and Jay-Z are great examples of that. But I think that, you know, we're saying the same thing, but Versus is an extension of that too, of, you know, creating an evening and a hype building up to it where we talk about the hits, we talk about the impact. We're looking at our OGs differently, and there is a different reverence and respect, I think, than there's been in times past. And shout out to the Universal Hip Hop Museum, which has already broken ground in the Bronx. Shout out to Rock the Bells. I mean, we have our station now where you can literally flip on the radio in your car or wherever and hear classic hip hop, as well as new mixed in. Like, we have an Ambrosia for Heads. I love that. And I think that we are getting to such a great place for that mainstream celebration, and not making it about the hip hop stars of today and tomorrow exclusively, but celebrating our forefathers and our foremothers and all of that, you know. And it's a great experience.
Yeah, and this isn't about us seeking approval, right? Hip hop has never sought approval, but it's about us getting our damn respect too, to quote LeBron James. You know what I mean? It's pretty dope to see it happen, you know, on the big stage. So next up, we've talked about him a couple times, but that's just a reflection of how big a year it's been. But you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, I mean, you just said it. We are in the midst of Dr. Dre's comeback campaign. And this one, you know, I remember in 1999 when he released, I know the years 2001, you know, or what was supposed to be the Chronic 2001. And that felt like a buildup. I still remember Dre pulling the 6'4" Impala onto, I don't even know if it was called TRL yet, but Carson Daly through Times Square, getting out with Eminem and the DOC and Snoop and having that moment. And this year, it's more poetic. You know, in January, almost 1 year ago, we learned that Dre had suffered an aneurysm and spent significant time in the hospital. And, you know, thanks be to God, we've learned that, you know, Dre is okay and healing and all of that. If you read TMZ or you read a lot of the gossip sites, you know, Dre has gone through one of the highest profile divorces. I would say, you know, in terms of hip hop artists, I can't think of a bigger one, which was allegedly finalized just weeks ago. But Dre has gone through a lot, you know, and also let's not forget, it's been 6 years since he put out the Compton album. I don't think that album was received, certainly to the extent of 2001 or The Chronic or Straight Outta Compton. And Dre is a man about legacy. Detox at this point has become a cliche. And all of a sudden this year, we started to hear that Dre's working. He's working on something, and then Snoop had alluded that it was a video game. And just now, recently, and literally in the last 10 days, we've gotten new Dr. Dre music through the Grand Theft Auto franchise. It's called The Contract. And, you know, shout out to Dre again. You know, he made his billions, not just off of music, but more off of evolving into, you know, merchandising and consumer electronics. Here's Dre being smart again. You and I have talked on this podcast about innovators like Travis Scott, you know, playing with Fortnite and putting on a concert in there. Like, the future is video games. And what other way do you have a captive audience that wants to consume your music than video games? You know, I'm in my 30s and I still remember playing Grand Theft Auto and enjoying songs that would come on the radio station. So Dre and his team putting new music out this way in a really respected brand, and the GTA brand, you know, we put this in the story when we reported it. You go back to Boys in the Hood, and Eazy says it's all about making that GTA. Like, come on. Like, I learned that phrase from NWA, and here you have Dre putting out new music through what has made Grand Theft Auto a household expression. So it's only right. And as you probably can attest to. The music is dope.
The music is super dope, and we'll talk about it in detail in a few minutes. But I think it's Dre at his finest since 2001 for sure. Like it's really incredible, and actually makes me hope that this is just like a sneak preview, that he's got more in the can, because this is really, really high quality music.
I think it is, and Dr. Dre is one of my favorite artists in all of history. And what's interesting about him is he kind of it's feast or famine, and I think we saw that after the 2001 album. All of a sudden, he was dedicating himself to Eminem albums, to Snoop's Last Meal and Blue Carpet Treatment. He was all up on, did a lot of things with Exhibit and so on and so forth. And I think that Dre is refocused. I think he's re-energized. I think he's about legacy. And now there's so many more interesting ways to release it. Evident in a video game. Also, like his artist Kendrick Lamar, Dre could literally decide right now while you and I are recording to put a body of work out or a single out. It's more power to the creator than there's ever been before. And I think over time, Dre was frustrated with the system of bootlegging and of reviews and not being able to tweak something at the last minute. So I think 2022, well, many things can happen. I'd bet the ranch on that Dr. Dre is a dominant artist and putting out a lot of art and music next year.
And I bet you there's some correlation between his putting out music now and everything he's gone through. Everything we hear about Dre is that he's a perfectionist. And the reason why he hasn't released the music is because he's constantly tweaking it, trying to make it better. But when you have something like a near-death experience, like an aneurysm, or you go through something that like completely turns your life upside down, like a divorce, it gives you different perspective. And I think you realize that tomorrow is not promised. It's not guaranteed. And so he's got to get this stuff out, man. I think he is a guy who cares about his legacy. And I think that he knows that despite the headphones and, everything else, the music is his true legacy. And like you said, Compton wasn't the coda. It wasn't the final chapter. And so if there's going to be one, I think he wants it to be right. So if this is an indication, he's definitely on his way. So next, go ahead. Well, next up, is a story that you broke for us, literally watching in real time. We talked about it recently in depth, so we won't go into it, but you can find the podcast. But Bone Thugs-n-Harmony versus 3 6 Mafia. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, man, I got my old ass up out of bed just because it mattered. It's a moment. And on one hand, and I think you and I have done probably the best job, I would say, but we've really celebrated the positivity of versus, the celebration of artists, the spirit of competition. But in anything, like battle rap, like sports, there's always going to be some controversy too. And yeah, I mean, in I guess round 4 of the Bone Thugs-n-Harmony versus 3 6 Mafia versus Busy Bone took umbrage with some of the things that were going on stage by his opponents. He said some things aimed at Juicy J and Gangsta Boo. Juicy J responded with an expression that, as Fat Joe eloquently put it, is a kind of drop the gloves moment. Like, you're going to fight or you're going to take an L if you don't do something. And Busy threw I believe a microphone and a bottle of water. And, it wasn't a bench clearing brawl. It wasn't a brawl at all, but both parties came to be. I think there was some swings. I don't know if those punches landed, but it was a moment. And, we spent an entire podcast talking about it. But what's interesting is, this particular versus, like a few others, there's a lot of history here. These groups aren't Bad Boy and Death Row, but there was a lot of 1990s speculation of who came up with that style, who came up with some of that imagery, various comments made, and it mattered. And, the reason why I think it has impact too is as we're talking about creating a culture around hip hop, I sometimes think that there are artists and there are movements and there are regions that go overlooked. And this matters. And absolutely everyone can cover it tomorrow morning when they hear about it. But you and I were texting at midnight last night about another podcast interview. Like, we are so passionate and dedicated. And this isn't to play our own bugle, but it mattered. And I wanted other people to know, we wanted other people to know and cover it with context. So we did so. And I think that it's a moment for Verzuz. It does not have the impact of a couple of the things we're going to talk about in a minute, but it shows why Verzuz is important. What's interesting to me is even though there's peace, like I saw DJ Paul recently say he hopes to produce an entire album alone for Bizzy Bone. There have been some interesting comments. Crunchy Black said he believes that Bizzy Bone did it because he felt as though 3 6 Mafia was up 3 rounds to 0. It's just one of those moments that gets a lot of discourse, and we want to create the stage for that and provide the context. So I do think it matters.
Yeah, the context is really important. You know, we've always been a site to not deal in just salaciousness. You know, I'll step back and say that I have no judgment about, like, I have no value judgments about what people like and what entertains them. You know, I'm not one who believes in censorship. I don't believe in, you know, but I also don't believe in exploitation. I really believe in, like you said, providing context so that there can be some, you know, there can be some depth and substance even in stories that appear on the surface as salacious. And I also think that the balance comes in providing all different perspectives and showcasing all different things. You know, we showcase a ton of very positive stuff. And I think that, you know, if you look at the scope of our coverage, 90% of it is positive. The 10% that, you know, is kind of like more, you know, in the, you know, I'm not going to use a judgmental term, but that is more, that is not as positive, is interestingly, and we'll get into that with the traffic, it is usually the stuff that drives the most traffic. And, you know, I think that's an interesting commentary on what it is that we like as human beings, you know, but again, I don't try and force feed anything. And we used to cover stuff on, you know, the environment, on LGBTQ rights, like, you know, activism, Black Lives Matter, all that stuff. But interestingly, it's typically the drama that draws the most interest, the most coverage, you know. And so we do that. You know, we're not trying to be some of the platforms out there that do it exclusively. And when we do it, we do it with care and judgment. But, you know, we got to have a voice in this too.
And lots of context. And, you know, to add to that, we couldn't leave the story right there, you know, and we did a whole podcast episode, and we also packaged it in an update of Bizzy Bone and DJ Paul and Fat Joe separately, but on the same podcast, providing additional context, first person context. We weren't just out for if it bleeds, it leads, and then leave it alone and not cover Bone Thugs and Harmony or 3 6 Mafia again for 5 years. It was about telling the complete story and providing an update, you know, and that's one of the things that I believe so much in what AFH is.
Yeah, our headline for the podcast was literally the biggest win came after the fight, because, you know, the altercation happens after round 3 or 4, something like that. And then, you know, after, you know, a moment, you know, tensions like dissipate, Bizzy rejoins, and they perform Crossroads together and embrace and like show each other love. And afterwards, DJ Paul, you know, talks about how he has nothing but love for Bone Thugs. Bizzy like comes on and explains and says he wasn't in his best like mood because he was ill and, you know, beforehand, and really should have conducted himself differently. So yeah, absolutely right. That's what we did for sure.
So from one Verzuz to another, both tense, but in very different ways. And shout out to Verzuz, you know, they a big part of 2021 and gave us these talking points throughout the year, but Big Daddy Kane versus KRS-One. And you and I literally changed travel plans. You know, my very first trip overseas to a different continent because this was scheduled. And I was like, man, you know, we got to cover this. And I also want to see it. I don't want to miss it. And boy, oh boy, did it have impact.
Yeah, man, it's wild. I remember you did that. I forgot it was for this one, but it ended up being our biggest podcast of the year by a factor of like 2. Like, it was gigantic for us, which is crazy. I don't think either one of us expected that. But, you know, it's interesting because the Verzuz itself was a bit disjointed. You know, first of all, just the context is I think a lot of people wanted to see Big Daddy versus Rakim. Big Daddy said that he always wanted to battle KRS-One because Rakim was not a battle rapper, KRS-One was, and Kane, prided himself on being able to mix it up with MCs, and so he wanted to go at the person that a lot of people saw as one of the best of that era at really battling, which is KRS. So they get on stage, and you and I saw two very different verses. I had Kane just whooping him for the first like 8-9 rounds, and and you saw it as more even than that. We ended up like very close in score. I think I had Kane winning by like 1. I think you were there or had like maybe a tie or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I had Kane winning. It was very close to a tie. And there was some understanding and context that we got afterwards from DJ Scratch. But
yeah,
continue anyway.
But you though, to your credit, you picked up on this really early. You said there was some tension going on, and you said there was some stuff going on with DJ Scratch, and I thought the tension was between Kane and Scratch, because there are a couple times where Kane was basically like, "Dead that, don't do that," and Scratch was going at Kid Capri. It seemed like they were supposed to be doing that, and Scratch seemed surprised, but he cut it off. It then came out the next day, though. DJ Scratch posted an Instagram, and I'll say that like our podcast got decent traction when we posted it first. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't like exponentially greater than anything else. It was like in there, probably top 5 or something like that. But the next day, Scratch gives context about what happened, and he said that KRS basically completely deviated from the plan. He was supposed to do one set list, did something completely different. There was supposed to be a format where Scratch and Kid Capri battled, like that got scrapped, and the whole thing got thrown off allegedly because Scratch says that the KRS just went completely off script and was not being cool. And so the inside dirt on that, when we posted that story the next day, exploded and became one of our biggest stories of the year and really amped up the podcast in a major way. But yeah, anything else you want to talk about with that?
Yeah, I mean, the original story was dope enough, and I mean, our context and our recap and round for round, even though I know the tie I got a lot of hell for that. It was like the scenario, and then you came with the remix by adding what Scratch had to say, and that really created a whole different light on the whole event, and it was massive and truly, if not for what I'm about to say, was the biggest versus I would say yet, period. But the next one, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to any hip hop heads, is the LOX versus Dipset. And, looking back, did you think that this would be, if you were to talk about the top 10 biggest things before it happened, do you think this would be anywhere close to that list of a year?
Not at all. Not at all. I saw those as two groups who were kind of underground heroes at the time. Obviously Dipset had some mainstream success, as did LOX, but the vast majority of their career has been underground. And but they've always had very, very devoted fan bases. So I could see it being kind of a niche success, but I didn't see it as being like one of the top versions and something that would dominate not only our news cycle, but like all of hip hop news cycle for days, and really just seeping into mainstream culture in a way that I would have never expected. But it really kind of revolutionized things for the LOX for sure. I think it put Verzuz back on the map. Verzuz has been up and down, but this is something that made it like once again kind of must see TV. And it was, most importantly, I think, a reminder of the legacy of New York hip hop. Hip hop is the birthplace. New York is the birthplace of hip hop. Obviously, West Coast plays a big part too, but Atlanta has ruled the roost for the better part of 15 years now. And this was a reminder that New York has got something to say.
Yeah, and I don't know if I 100% agree on the Atlanta part, but I definitely agree on your point on New York and New York slang, New York fashion, New York aesthetic, all through hip hop, has reigned, and it's really important to give those MCs their crowns for it. And I love to, I'll say it again. I thought the Bone Thugs 3-6 Mafia verses had some great song selection. I thought the performances in most places were pretty sloppy. This was the finest performance on the LOX side that I've ever seen on a versus. and Jadakiss to a massive extent. This was a career-defining moment for him. I mean, he is the top 5 dead or alive self-proclaimed MC, and he showed better than I think any song he's ever put out why that be the case. He came prepared. He worked the crowd. There was theatrics. There was pageantry, all within the on-brand way of D-Block the LOX. And again, that night, I mean, we almost did it as a, hey, you know, there's not a whole lot else to talk about this week. Let's cover this. And we taped our podcast right after that. I mean, we taped until like 2:30, 3 in the morning. And that was, and it didn't even, I didn't even feel tired because I was so exhilarated by what I had watched. And to me, I think that is one of the events that will not only keep the Verzuz brand strong for another year, another 2 years, another 10 years, but it really, the next time the LOX do something together, they are in better place than they've been since they were on Bad Boy.
It also redefined what Verzuz is supposed to be, because Verzuz, you know, initially started out with Swizz and Timbaland having a beat battle, and it was competitive. You know, they weren't like throwing each other shade, but it also wasn't a kumbaya, let's celebrate each other kind of moment. They were competitive. It was hip hop. But very early on, and maybe this is because of COVID and the situation we were in, it became very non-confrontational. It became very celebratory. Kudos. There was some shade, you know, Babyface certainly, and Teddy Riley certainly throwing shade, Babyface more so than Teddy even. But it was still done with a smile and like, you know, a plum. This was like, no, this is like brass knuckles, like, you know, we're going to mix it up and get into it, but we're going to be respectful. And, you know, these guys were very strategic. They let up in social media going at each other, but they had a concert planned together. They definitely were about that bag. And they wanted, yeah, and they wanted to put on a show, and it was more WWE than like, you know, than WBA. But Jada and, you know, Jim Jones and those guys really brought it to each other. And in some ways, I think it's what set up the altercation for 3 6 and Bone, because those guys didn't get the memo that these guys had really prepared for it and, you know, had a strategy. And I think they went in trying to do the same thing, and tempers flared, and like, you know, it went to where it did.
Every Verzuz is different. I mean, I think of the Jill Scott and Erykah Badu one, which was like a love fest in a really good way. I don't say that disparagingly. Like, you know, it was a celebration of each other. DJ Premier and RZA, which, you know, was one of the early ones of like, yo, 2 OGs kind of having a beat battle. They can take all different lights and meanings, and this one was the most impressive I've seen yet. And man, absolutely. So, you know, you and I have known each other now since 2013. So we're almost 9 years, and we've worked together for most of that. I mean, like, you know, apart from 6 months, all of that. And there have been a few times where you've said, this will be the biggest story of the month, of the week, a couple times of the year. And a couple times, you know, if we're going to use a baseball analogy, those might be like, you know, foul balls that go and then they curve. And a couple of them turn into extra base hits. This year, very recently, you were like Babe Ruth, allegedly in the 32 World Series. You got up to the plate, you pointed to the stands, and you smacked it out of the park. You called the biggest story, you know, this year, apart from one that we're going to talk about, which is a little different. I gotta let you kind of break that down for me.
Yeah, so the number 2, if you're keeping track, the number 2 biggest story of the year in terms of cultural impact is actually one that has multiple chapters. You know, so we talked about Verzuz, and our last 2 have been Kane versus KRS and Dipset versus LOX. The biggest Verzuz of the year is the traditional versus VS instead of the Verzuz, and that's been Drake versus Kanye West. And this is the culmination of more than 10 years of back and forth between these 2 dudes. So, you know, we've got extensive podcasts. I encourage you, if you really want to dive into it, we've got a couple this year and a ton of stories on the site, really kind of breaking down their history. But, you know, things culminated for these guys this summer when they were both in album mode, throwing shots at each other with diss songs, really going at each other with release dates, all sorts of things. And then like Kanye does his Drink Champs, which is another moment here we didn't talk about, but that's one of the biggest moments of the year was Kanye on Drink Champs. And it's because he was incredibly candid about everything from business to his on again, off again relationship with Drake. And, but weeks later, we find Kanye and Drake standing on steps together with Jay Prince, proclaiming peace and saying that they're going to do a benefit together for Larry Hoover. Now, you and I talked about this and we said, is this piece going to last? Is it, just for theater? Like what's the deal? But then the concert happens. Everyone like celebrates it. It's a big kumbaya moment. The two of them walk, in together. They walk off stage together. They embrace on stage, during the transition. They each perform one of each other's songs, the whole nine. Kanye's got a chip on his shoulders doing his greatest hits medley, almost treating it like a Verzuz. Drake does a very odd set, and it's 12 songs, not comprised of his biggest hits. He's got something like 254 like top 10 hits, 58 like top 10 joint. Like he's got like all sorts of. He's got an incredible number of songs, and so we started thinking about it. And last week we broke the story that actually Drake, it turns out, used his set, the vast majority of it, to diss Kanye. He's got a number of songs that have lines that seem to be directed at Ye. We've got a lot of context from Kanye himself saying that Drake doesn't just come at you straightforward. He'll sneak diss you. He'll do things in the background. He'll do all sorts of things to mess with your head when he's coming at you. And we were the only people to kind of pick that up. I saw in the comments, like, a lot of people were like, you know what? I thought I was the only one that caught that. Thank you guys for doing this. But still, no other outlets have really dabbled into it, but it became our biggest story of the year, which is incredible traffic wise. And I think a lot of that is because we own the story.
Yeah. And you're saying and really it's a credit to you. One of the things that I've struggled with just over my career, there's so much to execute. Hip hop moves so quickly. There's so many things to cover between the music, the news, the culture, so on and so forth. And, you are one of the most patient people. You're not somebody who spends your day scrolling social media. And this was true, 4.5 years ago when you listened to Damn and heard a theme when everyone was busy expecting a second album based on a rumor. You heard the fact that there were really two albums in it. If you play it one way and you played another, and you unpacked it hugely. And when we've talked about that, and there's a phenomenal article on the site that you authored. You're saying a lot of people just kind of wanted to see the pageantry of the show. Are they slapping hands? Are they doing this? What's the lighting? What's the song? Who are the guests? And you picked up on something really interesting. And what's fascinating about this to me too is, you and I spoke about the Kanye West Drink Champs episode and our difference of opinion on what the immediate headline was. What's the story here? And I was more in favor of what he had to say about Common or, Just Blaze. I was kind of running for the controversies there, and you focused in on the Drake thing. And Drake is a very curious artist with our audience. I would say that AFH is one of the sites that really represents quote unquote real hip hop. We cover the culture, the music, bars, our legends. And Drake, is a very polarizing figure. And when we shared this on our platforms and we put it on the site, it wasn't, a grand slam off the gate. This was an inside the park home run, which if you're a baseball fan is often more impressive, but you saw this and really saw the opportunity. And over time, there were, quite a number of people out there that were curious about this, and they found a home for the thought in the article. And if I may add something, since then, Amazon Prime's broadcast, they have removed the Drake parts apart from Kanye and Drake performing Forever, which may be a legality issue. But to me, Drake performing so many songs on Certified Lover Boy, which is coming out on OVO. It's not a Cash Money album. It's very much his album. I know it releases through UMG. Which is the same parent company as Kanye's catalog through Def Jam. I have to believe that there is more to play at here. And I don't think we've seen the last of it, but I'm going to give you credit, as spotting the first of it.
Yeah, man. Listen, like my background is I used to work with music rights and, getting stuff cleared for broadcasts. And I'm going to say, I don't think that this is just a legality issue. Amazon has got plenty of money to clear these songs for as long as they want. It's not like Drake's songs are going to be harder to clear than Kanye's songs. They cleared them for the broadcast, and typically what will happen is if you're only going to clear it for live, you'll do it for live plus 24 hours or something like that. It was up for longer than that. It was up for like 36, 40 hours. But then, we broke the story and all of a sudden it goes down. And, Kanye pays attention to these things. I have no doubt that somewhere it got to him. And, we talked about it that even he, after the show, they weren't like embracing and like, lovey dovey and like hand slapping. It was definitely not a love fest when they got off. So I'm not saying that we're directly responsible, but it wouldn't surprise me if, people caught wind. They're like, oh shit, like this is true. This dude really did throw shade. And they said, nah, I'm not having it, So yeah, this one was great for me. It's a reason why I think both you and I always want to have a voice in this culture, because we try to be thoughtful, bring different perspective and different angles to things. We try and support it in fact, so that we're not, just speculating and doing things that are wildly opinionated. And I think that the comments and the traffic itself reflect the fact that people see some merit in it. So, even if it's wrong, I think that we presented a pretty compelling case for why it might be the case.
Yeah, very well said. And you and I mean, I've had a few people this year, we've put more articles back on the site. We do a podcast most weeks out of the year. And, we put out an article in March of 2020 that, AFH was dead and hip hop lives. And more importantly, that you and I were going through changes in just what we wanted to do with our time. But I think of it, can't leave rap alone. The game needs us. And we've really, and it's been one of my great joys of the pandemic, has been covering this culture in new and different ways, and still using a site that we've nurtured and sacrificed for to get out there. And the number one story from an impact.
Before we get to that though, I do want to give like a 2B, right? Because I do think that it's worth talking about that Kanye Drink Champs interview in and of itself, because it was a moment for a long time. I think that beyond the Drake stuff, it was a big deal because, one, it was kind of Kanye's coming home. A lot of people have been very conflicted about how they felt about Kanye over the last several years, especially given his association with Donald Trump and wearing the MAGA hat and things like that. Two, it was kind of his, unbridled truth. He talked a lot about his money. He talked about the impact of the Yeezys. He talked about, what's happening in the community, and like, things that like, taking, but the arrests and war on drugs and things like that have removed a generation of young Black leaders. Like, he talked a lot about a lot of things very, very openly. And it was just and it's something that you and I haven't found surprising, because, and we talked about this before, if you unpack Kanye's interviews, he says a lot of interesting, very smart things a lot of the times, but they always get overshadowed by the salacious headlines or the low-hanging fruit, shall we say. So for us, it wasn't a surprise, but it was the first time a lot of people sat down and paid attention to Kanye in that way. And so it was a big moment. And it's also like a true hip-hop platform. Yeah. And, but that's also not surprising either, right? Like, Kanye has always been kind to Drink Champs. I mean, to Sway in the Morning, to Breakfast Club. Those have been some of his biggest interviews, and Drink Champs is that place now. And so they deserve that look. And so it's not surprising to me that he was on there too. But any other thoughts about that interview?
No, I mean, I think it absolutely was the most important interview, and one of the biggest of the year. And there's a lot to unpack there. Kanye is very deliberate, but at times scattered in his thoughts. And I think that he has been for a number of years, but absolutely. And I'm so glad that that was his first stop. And thus far, it's been his last stop. When we look at Donda and we look at this time and season, which includes the Drake, concert and whatever may come of it, this is how we document those times. And I do believe, Kanye is very internet savvy. I've heard over the years, I know for a fact he's read different things that I've written. These guys, Dre too, Fred Reck, one of Dre's producers used to say, Dre's always reading the websites, trying to see what's going on. And Yeah, I have a theory that on the Kanye tip, you may have shown something to his camp that they didn't necessarily realize was there at the time. But time will tell, and this is very much still an active story.
Where so number one, it's always the number one story of the year for us, and unfortunately, it deals with losses in hip hop, and we had a bunch this year. But you want to talk about those?
Yeah, I mean, this is no surprise, but I have never seen so much death within the hip hop community and within the culture that we cover as 2021. And even down to this weekend, as we'll discuss. But yeah, I mean, it's just like it happened in bursts too. There were times where people would pass away the same weekend or within 24 hours of each other, and from a litany of causes, litany of different pockets of hip hop. But I'm just gonna say, some of the names, and then I think we can talk about a few too. But Black Rob, UTFO's Kangol Kid this very weekend, Hub from The Roots, the bassist, Double K from People Under the Stairs, Black Alicious member Gift of Gab, obviously Young Dolph. I know we learned of it. It happened in 2020, but we learned literally in the closing hours of 2020. But MF Doom, the Fat Boys, Prince Markie D, aka Mark Morales, Chimudu, the hip hop photographer, writer Greg Tate, Caution member Gonzo, Zionized Zombie. And I'm going to say some other names that are important to our community too. Producer Chucky Thompson from Puff Daddy's Hitman, actor Michael K. Williams, comedian AJ Johnson, and obviously comedian Paul Mooney. And the tragic fact is those names that I mentioned right there are not everyone, but there were three really, and not to rank but the loss of Biz Markie. I mean, just for a second, that was somebody who over the recent years we knew was ill, but I don't think any of us expected him to pass when it happened. And a hip hop legend. And I know it's become a cliche, but I don't think Biz lived to receive his flowers.
Yeah, I agree. And, he had refashioned his career over time, was a great DJ, a phenomenal DJ. I attended some of the parties he did. Always great. He's a guy who always was positive, always cracking jokes, making a smile, trying to make people laugh. Nickname was the Clown Prince of Hip Hop. We saw that Verzuz with Kane, and there's no doubt that Biz would have been there had he been alive. That was just a huge loss for hip hop, and he's a guy who should have been on Drink Champs, and you could see those things coming for him. So yeah, absolutely, that was a loss that seemed like he was snatched, as all these people were before his time.
Most definitely. And then another that happened was Shock G from Digital Underground. And I think it's really important to look at Shock's musical contributions. Digital Underground is a group that doesn't get the props that they deserve, and obviously they've got histories in Oakland and Tampa, Florida, like places that are not New York and LA. They were on Tommy Boy, they weren't on necessarily like Def Jam or Universal. They weren't on a big label, but they were some of the first artists that brought funk into hip hop the way that they did. And you go back and listen to those albums, especially the early ones, and they hold up so well. And Shock G was like a Sly Stone. I mean, he was the musical mastermind behind it all. And I mean, literally had aliases like George Clinton, most of the time he was Humpty. And then you look at the butterfly effect of Shock. And if we don't have a Shock, I'm not sure that we get Tupac the way that we do. And, Digital Underground gave Tupac an opportunity to make some of those connections and eventually, step up to the mic and then do all that he did with it. And you and I spoke on an episode of Shock as a producer, as a performer, as a thinker, a real mystic journeyman of hip hop. And, that happened just a few days really after what I think a lot of people were most shocked by in 2021, which was the death of DMX.
Yeah, before we get to DMX, I want to talk a little bit more about Shock G because he connects so many of the things we've been talking about, right? So you mentioned Tupac, and he produced I Get Around and So Many Tears. some of like Tupac's most impactful songs. When you think about mainstream hip hop and its legacy, Shock G and Digital Underground did Humpty Dance, which was a breakout hit and gigantic across the boards. That was a pop charts success when hip hop was not hitting the pop charts. And then when you think about Clown Prince and people injecting humor and levity into hip hop, Humpty Hump was something that we'd never seen. We'd never seen a dude in costume like that, and just having a good time and making it fun like the original days of hip hop. And so, Shock G just brought so much to hip hop that, like you said, was underappreciated, but the legacy is immense and gigantic. And so, yeah, with that, the loss that I think that really sent real shockwaves, across the globe was DMX. And I know DMX is very important to you. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I often believe some of the most important music in your life comes out when you're, between like 12 and 15, 16. And my age falls into that. I mean, I remember being in junior high into high school when he had the 2-album year of, It's Dark and Hell is Hot and Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood. And DMX, after the death of Tupac, there was a certain hardness that wasn't coming on MTV or BET, of just gruff, rugged rap aesthetics. And X brought that, he carried on, but he made it his own. And over time, to watch X transition that into the early 2000s, album after album, what he represented, so much heart, so much authenticity, such an underdog. I mean, literally, he represented that and was able to, rock on the same tracks as Jay-Z, as Method Man, as Redman. He's such an important artist. And I know that, one of the bigger themes on our site over the last 5-7 years has been DMX's comeback. Swizz Beatz has been a champion of that. And throughout the years has always said, X is working. He's with these producers, he's doing this. We're getting him in the proper situation for this and that. And really, in early 2021, late 2020, that came to the light. Like, we knew that X is, he's back on Def Jam. He did the GQ interview last year. Things were starting to come together. His sobriety seemed like it was in a really good place. And, again, like sort of like what we were saying, we're at a time in hip hop where, Jay-Z can be looked at differently than he was when he was in his 30s. We can look at Dre differently. We can look at Master Ace or Royce or, whomever differently, Nas. And I felt like X was poised for a comeback, and he got very close. And obviously in early April, we learned that, he was rushed to the hospital and being hospitalized. And that was a story. Again, it was one of those things where, I was in the middle of traveling across country driving, and I literally pulled over because that is as important as anything, to let our readers know that, one of their heroes is suffering. And, some days later we got the news, and you actually reported his passing. And it was just, I will never, like Nipsey, like Pac, like Jam Master Jay, that's one of those things you will remember where you were when you learned that DMX had passed.
Absolutely. I went by the hospital a couple times and sent some prayers his way, when he was there for that week. And, I think the heart, a lot of times it's really the hardest when you see that a person is on the brink of something, something new, adding another chapter. And, X was on Drink Champs, and, Swizz Beatz had been talking about the album. We got the ultimate product, and it was a great album. And so we know that he probably would have been on tour, and he had a lot more coming. Similar to Young Dolph, like this guy who's making moves in the community and building wealth and on a label and empire, potentially going to change an entire community. That was why, Nipsey was so upsetting, is, similar kind of themes. And so it's a huge loss. X in his prime, represented so many things. And, on the one hand, like you said, he brought New York back. And New York had been back with Puff after, in Bad Boy, after really being kind of taken over by the West Coast for a while. But X brought that hard Scrabble, grit back that, had fueled New York rap for so long. But at the same time, he also fused elements of West Coast. And a lot of people compared him to Pac. And, besides the look, I don't think they were that similar in terms of their music, their production, but in terms of the things that they said and the way that they said it, talking about pain and pleasure and, being prophets and really speaking their souls. I think that was a connection they shared. And so, DMX was the guy who represented an entire generation. And, when you lose that person, like you said, who really kind of represents your coming of age, it's different. It's a different level of pain. And that was the case for me with Prince, and so DMX was definitely a huge loss for folks this year,
Most definitely. So, just to let people inside the kitchen, just for a few stories, a lot of what we just shared, but, we did decide to share some of our bigger traffic wins from what we share on the site, which again is, a few stories a week, sometimes not if there's nothing to say, but, Ambrosia for Heads, we really try to value our readers' time. And, there were some interesting things that transpired this year that are worth just in passing mentioning. Do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, I think we'll just go down the list for this one. Like, it's also interesting to me because we're a very social media driven site. A lot of our activity comes from Facebook, some on Instagram and other platforms too. But, I think when people actually click through, it shows the true level of interest beyond just the likes that you get. And it's not always the same. It's not always the same that the stories that are most liked or reach the most people on social media are the biggest stories in traffic. But we'll go through these relatively quickly. There, we talked about a lot of them in the cultural impact, but there's some ones that stand out and I think really help to kind of fill out the story for the year in hip hop for AFH readers especially. So number 10 was Griselda made a sequel to Mobb Deep's a Mobb Deep classic. And which
Hell on Earth.
Yeah, Hell on Earth, right. Griselda has been a gigantic story for us this year and the last 2 or 3 years. So Westside Gun, Conway the Machine, and Benny the Butcher. Seemingly anything we post of Griselda related is definitely doing numbers. And so it wouldn't be right to talk about 2021 without mentioning them. And this was just, every once in a while we'll do a post just to kind of draw people in and showcase a song, but also let them know about the existence of our playlist, which we think is a great reflection of where hip hop is today, current hip hop, and the amazing music that comes out regularly. And this is one we did, pretty low effort, but it was gigantic. And I know you posted it. Were you skeptical at first about it? Like,
yes and no. I mean, I thought the record was really interesting. It was one that comes over time. You listen more and you like it more. And I think that this one draws people in because, I'll say Westside Gun, I think, is a polarizing figure, less and less to people. But I think when he burst on the scene, and he burst on the scene 10 plus years ago, but around 2016, 17, 18, 19, when he really started leveling up, there were, devoted hip hop heads that were in his fan club, and there were folks that were skeptical because I think, as Wes himself has said, he doesn't always approach things to bar you to death. A lot of times he sets the stage with vibe. So to watch a new crew come in and pay homage and make a sequel to a Mobb Deep record, and obviously, Prodigy is no longer with us. Mobb Deep is held in the highest. It draws people in, and I think Griselda more than delivered. And you're absolutely right. When we cover these guys collectively or individually, it usually reflects an impact in numbers on the site. But one of the things that I like that we do is all three of those guys are very prolific. So when we cover them, we really try to find the narratives and the best material, and this delivered. And there was a lot of context to it, and it did well. And I'm pleased with it. Anything you want to add?
No, that's it. I think you captured it. So number 9, no surprise, it was the passing of Black Rob. And the next wave is really a lot about the losses that we mentioned before. Yeah. Number 8 is DMX's new album coming, and it being filled with superstars. That was obviously a reflection of people mourning the loss of X, but I think it's worth talking about Exodus for a minute. That album was entirely produced by Swiss Beats. It was a reunion of those guys that they've constantly worked together over the years, but they had not worked together as extensively in many years. And Exodus was definitely like a star-studded type affair. Just some of the artists that it had on it were, so we had Snoop, we had the LOX, we had Jay-Z, Nas, Lil Wayne, Alicia Keys, Bono, Westside Gun, Benny, and Conway from Griselda, as we said. There was a song with Usher. Yeah, mentioned Snoop. And then Moneybagg Yo, that one was interesting. That was a last-minute replacement for Pop Smoke. Apparently that verse had gotten leaked on an album before that. But the album, is Grammy nominated, not for Album of the Year, but a song. But yeah, people were really, really excited by the anticipation of what that album was going to bring, and the track list was a huge one. Number 7 was Shock G, passing away from Digital Underground. We talked about that. 6 was X's the announcement of his overdose. You want to go 5 through 1?
Yeah, sure. Number 5, which we alluded to, was DJ Scratch explains the tension at the Big Daddy Kane and KRS-One Verzuz. That was, again, important bookend context to something that a lot of people tuned in on, but probably didn't necessarily catch. And we had discussed, we mentioned a moment ago, but Busta Rhymes' VMA performance is a drop the mic moment back in September. Number 3, Bone Thugs and Harmony and 3-6 Mafia clash with Fight During Versus. That was in December. And we followed it up, like I said, with some more context once it was available from Busy and DJ Paul. Number 2, DMX has passed away at age 50. That was the story. And just this week, the home run call that I alluded to, as you said last week, Drake dissed Kanye West throughout their concert.
Yeah, it's crazy to me that, we talked about this before. We almost did this wrap up a couple of weeks ago. And if we had done it, we would have missed the Dr. Dre album. We would have missed the Kanye Drake concert, like all that stuff. It's wild, but the year end, people go hard all the way through the end of the year now. So I'm glad we waited for this, even if it has less traction. I think it tells a more complete story of what the year is. But it's wild to me that a story we did less than a week ago is already the biggest one of the year traffic-wise.
Yeah. That was wild. And a lot of that was, again, people on the internet, curious, saw something, wanted a place to see what others had to say and probably get some more information on it. And once you see it, it's something you want to show somebody else. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So last but not least, so AFH, we started off as a site. We've got a really robust social media presence. We've now got Spotify. But the podcast is relatively new, and it's something that we started a year and a half ago or so, in the midst of the pandemic. The lockdown was terrible for a lot of us for a lot of reasons, but it also yielded a lot of really amazing things, including Verzuz, which we've talked about a lot here, and for us, you and I, the podcast. And so a lot of the themes in the podcast were overlapped with the stories we talked about before. But a couple things that we want to mention that fall outside of that is another huge moment for hip hop on the AFH scope was the beef between, or I'm not even going to say beef, the back and forth between Royce 5'9", Lupe Fiasco, Mickey Factz, Ransom, RJ Payne,
38 Special,
38 Special, yeah, quite a few people were embroiled in a back and forth, and it was really about just straight up lyricism. Like who is that guy? Who's that spitter? Who can do it the best? And so we did a breakdown of that, and I think it was one of the more comprehensive ones out there, where we really recap not just the music that was being released, but also the Instagram, conversations that were happening, really trying to flesh out the full story. And that was one of our biggest podcasts of the year too. I think it was like number 3 was our breakdown of that. And then we had a great interview with Mickey Factz and Blue, where Mickey talked about that too. Mickey released, I think, the best disc record of the year and one of the best disc records I've ever heard in my life. I still listen to this day and marvel at it. WRAiTH is an incredible, incredible work. Like just the lyricism is insane, the references. If you truly understand the context and nuances and all the things that happen, he brings so many things into that record. And if you understand like his opponent, Royce, and everything that he brings to the table, his style, he's doing impersonations of RJ Payne and Ransom in their style. He's talking pop culture references. He's got double on top. It's just, he checked a lot of boxes. And if you kept up with this whole thing, you understand what that means. But that was really incredible. That was just pure unadulterated hip hop. So that was actually one of my favorite events of the year. And that's something that goes on the radar when you talk about traffic numbers and overall cultural impact. But in our circles, the impact of that can't be underestimated.
Yeah, and the whole, again, I don't want to use the word beef either, but the whole brouhaha, a lot of it happened on IG Live. A lot of it happened in these 2 and 3 hour conversations, and you and I try to create a podcast that presented a timeline and really opined on your part and mine of who was in the right, who was in the wrong, or what, not even that, but what the cause and reactions of each. And then to have Mickey, who supported our podcast and said, you guys really broke it down, to then talk to a primary source was really interesting, and I totally agree with that one.
Yeah, we also got to have some great interviews this year. Among them was we got to talk to AZ, and that's an interview that was probably 4 years in the making.
Yeah.
For about his Do or Die 2 album, which is a great project. Got to talk to Joell Ortiz about the Autograph album. Joell gave us one of the, it's just a great conversation, like incredible insights. We got to talk to Skyzoo. That was amazing. We talked to T. Eric, which is great. We've had some really
evidence,
evidence, incredible interview.
Kurupt, we've had some good ones.
Yeah, Kurupt, yeah, some great interviews this year. So, we encourage people to check those out. And then I think last is Jay-Z. So, Jay-Z, we talked about his cultural impact with the Super Bowl, but he also and Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but he also made waves in the business tip with the sale of his stake in Armagnon de Briac, or whatever
Ace
it is.
of Spades, yeah.
Ace of Spades and Duce, and then also Tidal. And so we kind of broke down those transactions and speculated as to what Jay might have used the capital for going forward. But I think that really showcased, us talking about hip hop in a business sense. We did that with De La Soul too, and the repurchase of their catalog, and ultimately allowing them to be on DSPs, and that should be coming soon too. But it's been a fun year in that regard too.
Yeah, my man Slav hit me and he was like, yo, you guys ever talk about NFTs? And we have a few times, but that Jay-Z episode, you and I kind of forecast why Jay-Z is very focused on intellectual property right now, and kind of the things that go beyond the music that are part of his career and those around him. And I'm really proud of that episode too. That was really good. And we've spent a lot of time over the last 2 years in a similar way talking about Nas and how he's leveled up. So there's some really good business discussions. You mentioned the De La as well as the music, but
yeah,
as we talk about music, it's the perfect segue, man. I mean, every year we tend to look back, and you and I each year, I think, feel sometimes that lists mean less and less, and we talk about that, but we're here because of the music before all else, and that's one of the things that I love. I love seeing a Griselda song up there with anything that's salacious or tragic. I like the music to always be present. So I want to talk to you. We're both going to speak about it, our favorite albums of the year.
Yeah. And, it's not a ranking, at least for me. It might be for you. I'm curious about that.
Yeah.
But we're going to just go through our top 10 real quick. And each of us have different top 10s. I think there's a ton of overlap, though, as I look at it. So why don't you kick it off? Why don't you go through yours first?
Absolutely. I'm going to say this about that, as my Uncle Dan likes to say. For me, this year, I look back and the top 5 was very clear to me throughout. That was very easy to determine. A top 10 was a little bit harder. So I'm going to start And this is actually ranked just for me. And I'm, you know, I do this just as a reminder to keep listening to these albums and really kind of go back and see what my favorites are. And number 5 was Mach-Hommy with Pray for Haiti. You know, we did a mid-year back in June or July where we spoke about the best works up until this point, and you have gone hard in the paint for this album since about a week after it was out. I think when it first came, you might have been busy, but you were the one that was in my ear of how great this was. And I, in the second half of 2021, this LP has just really impressed upon me. I think it's a great body of work within the Griselda catalog, and that was sort of a homecoming for him. What a phenomenal artist, an intricate lyricist, a great producer. You know, did a dope feature in GQ that I've been reading, and it's cool to learn a little bit more about the man behind the flag, so to speak. But I think that's a true body of work for him. Your favorite songs on that are the same as mine, so I'll wait for you on that. Skyzoo, all the brilliant things. We had Sky on the show, one of my favorite conversations. I think Sky is incredibly consistent, and despite me saying that, I think this is his best body of work. He made an album 2 or 3 years ago with Pete Rock, Retropolitan, that you and I got really behind. It was on our best of list for that year. And obviously you do something with Pete Rock, it's going to have a level of quality on it. And I think that they were very much like a Murs and Ninth Wonder, like an equal billing there. This is Sky on his own. And it's an album very much themed around gentrification, specifically of Brooklyn, and how this place that Sky has loved and referenced in so many of his lyrics is changing, and how that's his own past and identity changing, and his role as a son, as a father. It's a really dense, beautiful album. Bed-Stuy is burning. Oh, go ahead.
And I'm gonna chime in too. Like,
Okay.
I'm so for the ones that were overlap, I'm just gonna chime in too. So, so just going back to Mach-Hommy real quick. The favorite songs we talked about were No Blood, No Sweat, Marie, and the Stellar Ray Theory. I gotta say, Stellar Ray Theory might be the song that I played the most all year. Like, you know, the thing that I love about Mach-Hommy is, first of all, his voice is so distinctive, and his deadpan delivery, you know, it reminds me a lot of like Boldy James, like just like it's emotionless, but it's also merciless and just conveys so much. You know, Rock Marcy's a bit like that too, but you know, the guy's wordplay is just so incredible. He's next level brilliant in terms of like his references and things like that. And Stellar Ray Theory, I mean, he'll even talk about stuff like, you know, tell Ghazi I build my own empire. Like, you know, for if you know underground hip hop and you understand that Empire is like kind of like the universal music group of underground hip hop, basically. And, you know, heading that up is Ghazi. Like, you know, he makes references like that, that if you know, oh shit, this dude is on a different level. And for most people, just goes over the top, you know, over their head. But incredible. And I think since he's teamed up with Griselda, like Boldy James, his music has only gotten better. And for Sky, you know, not only is it thematically incredible, and he's another dude, and he's talked about this a lot in his interview, where you got to listen to his music over and over again. And there's stuff you'll catch years later because the references are so dense, and you really have to understand what he's talking about to get it. But on top of that, it's just such a sonically beautiful album. Like, he picks so many incredible jazz samples and things like that, that just, it just is a beautiful album. I listened to it again today, and like, there's just so many songs. I could have filled the playlist with like 8 different joints from this, but incredible album. Sorry, go.
Yeah, no, just a true benchmark in his catalog, and something that I will come back to listen for the rest of my life. Number 3 is an artist that I continue to be excited about, Lute, with his album Goldmouth. And Lute, you know, is definitely part of the Dreamville family, was on Revenge of the Dreamers 3. But I often think, like, you know, Lute sometimes gets lost in the sauce when people talk about Dreamville, and they get really excited about Earth Gang and JID and obviously J. Cole and Boss. But Lute, you know, Charlotte, North Carolina MC, makes incredible music. And, you know, this album has a lot of soul to it. And, you know, he had started piecing out singles in 2020 with like Getting Every Dollar, the GED record, which I think the minute I sent it to you, you know, last year, you're like, boom, playlist. Like, we love that record mutually. I'm also a fan of the other single, Myself, with Devin. And then he makes these songs that, deal with relationship. Like, and I know that sometimes in hip hop, those are the records that we tend to skip over sometimes. I thought Joell Ortiz in his conversation with us, he talked about writing a verse that he put on his album that he used literally as his wedding vows. I really appreciate well done love rap records, and Ghetto Love by Lute with Black Soul and Ari Lennox that's the joint too. And I love, Dreamville's had a big year, as we're going to talk about in a second, but I know that's an album you really like too.
Yeah, man, I love so Dreamville. I think Dreamville and TDE to me are the two best collectives out of the 2010s. You know, Boss, I love. You don't hear enough about him. Um, Earth Gang, JID, I think is an exceptional talent. In fact, I don't know that there's more. I haven't heard an MC with more talent since maybe Kendrick. I think he's up there. He's up there. Anderson Paak level artistry. He can do a lot, and I still think he's waiting for his breakout moment. I think he's going to be gigantic, or I hope he can be. All that being said, Lute might be my favorite MC on Dreamville. Of Kaz too, but like he might be his voice. There's something so penetrating about it, and everything he's put out, I've been a huge fan of, and it took me a while. You loved this album before I did, and in fact, it wasn't until today that it really made my top 10. But in listening to it, there's undeniable greatness, and it's an album that I'm going to spend time with. I can tell, like, over time, and that's criteria for me for selecting these in general. Is will I go back to them beyond this year?
And this is a lean back album. I mean, I think that's true of Sky and Mach as well. But you can play Lute's album in the car. You can play it as you're cooking dinner, cleaning your house. It just works, and it's a versatile album. It's all killer, no filler. But he didn't chase a hit. It's not a bar you to death album. It's very much like an introspective joint. And in 2021, which, with all the death, all the tragedy, all the confusion that we've all gone through, it's a worthy piece. So for me, my number 2 album, I want you to talk about it, because I think you've gone really, really hard for this record. We did an entire podcast episode to it. But it's J. Cole's The Off Season. And I know that that's very, very high on your list too.
Yeah, Cole, it might be my number 1. It's really tough. But Cole did it again. KOD was my favorite album of that year by far. I think it was 2018. And, ever since 2014, Forest Hills, like he's been on a can't lose kind of like streak for me. But The Off Season, was Cole returning back to mixtape form. This to me was a mixtape in disguise. It was more polished. It had bigger hits, but it was Cole having fun. He wasn't tied to one theme like he was on KOD. But different production styles. He had tons of bars. He had guest features for the first time in a long time. This was Cole being free, but also being like surgical and an assassin in what he was trying to accomplish, and he rolled it out in the same kind of great way that he has the last couple of albums. He did a film, like a 14-minute documentary, really showcasing where he was, how he got to this place. He did a freestyle with LA Leakers. It's one of the best freestyles of the year.
Yeah.
And then he released the album, and he had songs like My Life, which is incredible. With Moray and 21 Savage. He had 100 Mil. He incorporates trap sounds, but does it in a way that he owns it. He's not like, clout chasing or trying to be, like the younger artists. The Climb Back was one of the songs that he released previously, but fits really well and got great lyricism to it. Pride is the Devil is a departure for him. He's singing. It's got a reggae feel to it, very different sound for him. And then I think maybe the song that will stand out the most is Let Go My Hand. He's talking about, himself growing up. He's talking about being a father now and raising his son and seeing the parallels and the things he's trying to do for his son to make him a better man than he is. He talks about his altercation with Puff Daddy, and, how foolish that is when he looks back on it. But then he has Puff himself like do a prayer like at the end of it. It just is so deep, and those are just few of the songs. This one of those albums where I can literally play front to back. It's not overly long. The artwork is iconic with him, standing in front of a basketball hoop that's on fire. Like just thematically, everything about this album I love.
Yeah, I mean, J. Cole is building a Hall of Fame catalog, and that's not a new development, but I'm very much pulling for this album and the upcoming Grammy Awards. I would like to see Cole, as we talk about the mainstream, embrace of hip hop. We dedicated a whole episode to it on What's the Headline. J. Cole is the Tim Duncan of hip hop. I want to see Cole get, his Friday Night Lights, in the mainstream. So, and I know to a large degree he already has. My definitive #1 album of this year, and it's funny, in 2018, KOD came out and Evidence from Dilated Peoples and Step Brothers released Whether or Not. And those two albums were very close, and I think that was the same year as Royce's Book of Ryan, those three. Here we are again, 2021, and Evidence did it again for me. He put out an album called The Unlearning Volume 1. It's Ev's first deviation from the Weatherman series with a full length. And the Weatherman series goes from 2007 to 2018. So this is a new chapter in Ev, and a lot of those qualities that I love in Evidence's music and really always have, even with Dilated, they're there. I mean, he's rapping like it's an A and B conversation, kind of venting his innermost truths, but there's a lot of wordplay. There's a lot of kind of just truthisms, these cool kind of like, just gems for your life. And I really like this album. A lot of it is self-produced, but he also brought in, his stepbrother Alchemist. He brought in Knots. He, there's a really, really dope team around it. And all of that said, when Spotify sent out their Wrapped, that was my most listened to song this year, which is the collaboration with Boldy James. Came out before the album. Just really an incredible record, incredible production. Lost in Time, Park Jams, that's another highlight for me, which is, again, Ev looking at his life, looking at not being able to sleep, a lot of the traumas that he's faced, being a hyper talented artist, being a 25-year rap veteran who I don't think necessarily gets his props, but also has built a really nice career out of, his hip hop ability. And then a song that you and I mean, we spoke to Ev about it, and it's one that, speaks a lot to 2021, Tailor Made Suit, which is a song that he says, my wedding suit is the same as my funeral suit. And, Ev talks about it on the album. He spoke about it on his last album. He lost his partner and the mother of his son to cancer. And it is as vulnerable and a personal record as you're going to get. And it's, you feel like you're having a conversation with somebody. And this album, it's just got a lot of range and depth to it. He's got Conway on there. It's an album that I just kept coming back to. Spotify told me I'm in the 1% of Evidence's most listened to fans, and maybe I'm biased, but I think he continues to make the best work in his career.
Yeah, I bet I'm in that 1% too, because if there's any album, if it's not Cole, it's this one. For me, at the very top, it's the one I've listened to the most. And, I co-sign everything you said. Evidence is just about truth. I think those are the albums that resonate the most with me. That's why Skyzoo does too. And all these artists that we've talked about, but he goes so deep, and he even talks about like the fact that, people question why he's so honest on his records and say that it might be holding him back, but he doesn't care. It's his art. And, I think that kind of courage, that kind of like vulnerability is what inspires us all and is what really penetrates for us. And then just musically, again, just it's so incredible. There's a song, I think it's Won't Give Up the Danger, where he talked to us about the fact that he uses this, there's the sample, but then there's another version of the sample which flips the chord progression, and it drives me crazy. It's just such an incredible usage, but this album is amazing. And I was a big fan of the last album too, but this one I like even better. This guy, there's nothing he has done in the last like 10 years that I haven't just loved. So yeah, incredible album.
So I went pretty hard on my top five, and I do have others, and they're really echoed in yours. But talk to me about some of the albums on your top 10 list.
Yeah, so some of the ones we haven't discussed yet are Westside Gun. We'll say Hermes 8 sides A and B. It might be a bit of a cheat because some people consider these as two different albums. I consider it as one because he himself has spoken about it as being a double album, even though he released it over the course of a few weeks. And I think that's a smart tactic on his part because our attention spans are short now. He's able to do different artwork. It might be advantageous with the streaming platforms and the algorithms too. But I think that, he's just an incredibly genius marketer and strategist when it comes to music. And he put out a lot of great songs. So, for me, Hell on Earth Part 2, Draymond, Right Now, Survivor Series 95, and Ostertag, and Stove Got Cooks gets a really prominent role on side B, especially. And I think, so you and I both talked about his album last year. That made a lot of people's year-end lists, a lot of kind of like tastemaker type publications. It did not do it for us, but, for this one, having him on, Guns Beats really opened up his sound for me and what he brings to the table. So I thought that was dope. So Westside Gun is a big one for me. That's been in heavy rotation and obviously is, a big staple within the Spotify playlist that we have. A recent addition, and another thing we would have missed had we done this a couple weeks ago, was Dr. Dre's The Contract. That is just I think it's 6 songs. I think maybe people are still mining it. It's either 5 or 6 songs. So it's not a full album. It's more of an EP. But the track list is sick. He's got Rick Ross. He's got Snoop. He's got Busta. He's got Eminem, Nipsey Hussle, just an incredible lineup on it. Co-production with The Alchemist and, a bunch of other folks. But, songs like ETA, his joint with Busta and Snoop, and Anderson .Paak, who we didn't even mention, real soulful, and the interplay between them, where one person will start rapping, another person will finish, and it does that across like, 3 different artists, 4 different artists when you include Dre. It's Dre rapping. And like, dude, I don't know if you, I'm listening for the ghostwriters because we all know Dre doesn't write his raps. And dude, I think Pharoah Monch might have I hear a lot of Pharoah Monch in there. We know the DOC is involved with it. But I'm trying to, because there's some cadences that are really familiar to me, but super dope. Mm-hmm. But also him kicking things that are very, very true to who Dr. Dre is. So clearly, these are people who've sat with him, who've studied him, who've interviewed him. Whatever they're doing, they're really tapping into his life. But the flows are sick. Diamond Mine, you mentioned the song with Nipsey is great. That's the one that's. And then Gospel is the one with Eminem, and that's fantastic too. One of the better Em and Dre collaborations in a long time.
You got DOC rapping on it, which was really cool. We pointed that out on the site, and DOC retweeted it. And yeah, I mean, I love to see that. That's again a callback to Dre's legacy, and yeah, I wondered the same thing, and I really hope that we can get high quality versions of this to the DSPs. I think that'll happen. I'm sure there's an exclusivity window with the game, but I do, like we said, I think we're gonna get a lot more Dre music.
Yeah. So another legend who came back, and it's not even a comeback for him because he did it last year too. And I know this is on both of our lists, is Nas, King Disease too. So King's Disease won Best Rap Album last year. Great album, Ultra Black, one of my favorite records. Full Circle with The Firm, maybe my favorite record of 2020. I played that over and over and over again. And it's got a G-funk feel to it with that, rolling bass line. And like Nas, talking about like, I get my boxing trainer. He's my logic explainer, conversations and our combinations. Like, lines like that, man, just stick out. But as good as the album was, I think King's Disease 2 is even better. Both are Hit Boy collaborations. Hit Boy produced them in full. This is not like, I think at its finest, it's a top 5 Nas album for me. Songs like The Pressure, which kicks it off, really moody, Rare, Nobody. He has a verse with Lauryn Hill, which is, in contention for verse of the year. That to me, and Andre 3000's Life of the Party from Kanye West, Donda. Composure is a great song where Hit Boy actually gets in the mic too. And then My Bible sounds almost like a Just Blaze production, and might be my favorite track on the entire album. But that one is great. Nas is now just his year has been incredible too. Another big story we didn't mention was his cashing out, with the Coinbase investment. The news reports have him somewhere in the $50 to $200 million range in terms of like how he cashed out with that. In either case, he got a huge check from that. And Nas is in his comfort zone. He produced the Ralph McDaniels. You're watching Video Music Box documentary for Mass Appeal in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of hip hop. And King's Disease 2 is just Nas in his bag. He's comfortable. He's got a great production collaborator, probably his best since Large Professor, and he's just doing it. So I love this album.
Yeah, and you didn't even mention, EPMD 2 with Eminem and EPMD. And that was great to see. That Nobody song with Lauryn is insane. To me, and I saw that Barack Obama put that on his annual playlist among his favorite songs, which was great to see. That'll bring attention to that record. But yeah, that
Death Row East.
Yeah, that album's all up on my top 10 as well. So yeah.
Yeah. So another one for me is Sally and Apollo Brown. So Apollo Brown has quietly made some of my favorite albums of the last 5 years. He's worked with Joell Ortiz and Razzcast and now Stally and I believe Odyssey, right?
Well, they've done stuff together, but OC,
OC, yeah.
Planet Asia.
Yeah, Planet Asia. Some really, really great collaborations where he'll just work with a single, Chez Noir, work with a single album. And so the one he did this year is with Stally, who's been one of my favorite MCs of the last 10 years or so. I've supported and worked with him in a number of levels. AFH, Music Matters. He's among the first interviews that AFH ever had back in the day. Wow. Just a great dude, and this album, Blacklight, so many joints on it. I love Apollo's like moody sample-based style. He's got this technique where he'll mute the sample and to bring it up and down, and just creates a whole vibe. And so standout songs for me are Blacklight, Humble Winds, which is the first single. I heard just the first 3 or 4 bars of that, and it was instant add to the playlist.
One of my songs of the year, hands down.
Incredible. Love Me, Love Me Not, No Monsters, We Outside, The Realest. Just this whole album is another one of those that's kind of unskippable to me. And to your use your term, it's headphone rap for sure. You're not going to be out dancing to it, but you listen to this in the car, at nighttime while driving or rocking with headphones. You need to zone out. This is an album to do that.
Yeah, hands down. You have a and I really appreciated this one too, and it's great. I always thought Stally deserved more, and it's not a criticism of Rick Ross, but he was on MMG, the other MMG, and now he's with this MMG, and it's great to see him. I think this is his best body of work. I know you've been a fan of some of the early stuff, but it's great to see. It's great to see, and Apollo just continues to show range. Yeah.
And the only other one I have that doesn't overlap with you, so just to recap for me, my top 10 albums in no particular order are J. Cole, The Off Season, Evidence, Unlearning, Volume 1, Westside Gun, Hermes 8, Sides A and B, Mach-Hommy, Pray for Haiti, Dr. Dre, The Contract, Skyzoo, All the Brilliant Things, Stally and Apollo Brown, Blacklight, Lute, Goldmouth, Nas, King's Disease 2. And the last one for me on my list is Russ, Chomp 2, another one that just dropped in the last couple of weeks. This is an album that is a surprise to me because I've never really dug into Russ's catalog like that. I've always admired his movement. I really like guys who are independent and like, take the reins by their own hands and really make it happen for themselves, without radio airplay, without necessarily even mainstream media coverage, and just like really do it. And Russ is one of those dudes. He's been controversial, got a big ego, never really like hidden that. Um, but he decided to make an album with just like true spitters. And so a lot of the people we've talked about on this podcast, either today or throughout the year, are featured on the album. It's got Ransom, Papoose. There's a verse from The Game that I think is one of the best verses the Game has dropped in years. Styles P, Westside Gun, Jadakiss, Big Crit, Snoop, Jay Electronica, Hit Boy, Sci-Hi, the Prince, Conway the Machine. Like, it's really and Ghostface Killer too. Really incredible guest list. The beats are impeccable. And Russ brings his A game too. Like, he's on there to rap with these dudes, and he holds his own, And so there are a lot of joints on there that are like Sheep. Interestingly, some of my favorite songs are the ones that he's just doing by himself. Sheep kicks it off, and very personal song. A tremendous salute. Free, Hustler, Freestyle, Distance, Get It, like all songs that I think. But this is another album where I can just go front to back, and I'll be really light. Mozzie's on the album too, really light with the skip, if at all. So that's another one. He got superstar producers too. He just went in on this album. It's pretty crazy.
Most definitely, great listen. Just out of fairness to the list, you mentioned Nas. I said was part of my top 10.
Oh yeah.
Go
ahead. Go ahead.
I want to give a shout out first to the beat. Crisis, put out an album, The Hour of Crisis, that you actually did a whole post on our site for. And a lot of people, I believe Crisis has won a Grammy. When Ninth Wonder was building out the Soul Council, Crisis was like he was the Pippen and Ninth Jordan, if that's a fair comparison. And Crisis did joints, I believe, on the Minstrel Show, did one, I think, maybe two, did stuff with Sean Price in those days when Ninth was working with Duck Down, and has really expanded. I mean, he's got 20 years just about of hits, but he made this album, and it's a producer compilation style record, but it's really a cut above the rest. He has my favorite Del, the Funky Homo Sapiens song in years, called Keep Walking On, which is just one of my joints this year. Del is in full, like, locked in wisdom mode. Mr. Big Mouth, the De La Soul joint, and then I must seem like an Evidence stan, but there's a joint on there called Asylum. I really, really like this record. It's an easy, pleasurable listen. It shows Crisis's range. And shout out to Jamla. Rhapsody did not put out an album this year, but Jamla's making moves. I sent you yesterday a joint by Ian Kelly that I really like too. The last three to close out my 10 are very much about the MC, even though they have great producers involved with them. Armand Hammer and Alchemist put out a joint called Haram, which we talked about in brief earlier this year. And Armand Hammer is the duo of Billy Woods and Elucid, two very, very, very talented MCs. And they remind me a lot of stuff you might have received on like Fondulum, early pre-priority distribution Ruckus back in the day. I mean, MCs that don't care about necessarily being so in the pocket. It's more about what they say. And similar to what you said about Mach, there is so much to unpack. You'll catch a reference or make a connection. It's very impressionistic style. And Alchemist, who's doing these incredible albums. I mean, last year, Grammy nominated with Gibbs for, Alfredo, to come in and produce these guys over in Brooklyn, over in New York, and make a really incredible body of work. And then, if I'm not mistaken, they performed it together on Summer Stage. And, we're living in a really interesting time for quote unquote underground independent hip hop, where, some of the biggest people making music are paying closer attention, and they're able to make an album like this. And the whole Backwoods Studios movement, I've been a fan of for years, but this is a true jewel in their discography. And an album, Earl Sweatshirt's involved, Curly Castro, Imani, like people that I come back to and listen, but it's a lean back experience. Another album about the MC to me is The Plugs I Met Too. And you and I, back in March when this came out, touted it as one of the best albums that had come out this year. It's a very short album. The Plugs I Met franchise is sacred to any Benny the Butcher fan. he came back with Volume 2 and did it all with Harry Fraud. And Harry's had a great year. I mean, done great stuff with Jim Jones and Currency. He's been in the mix for a really long time. But I feel like for as versatile and, sometimes Harry Fraud can make beats that jump out in front of the MC. He let Benny do his thing. And I've really enjoyed this record. I mean, Benny does not deviate from, what he's always given you. But the standout joint to me, oddly enough, is Survivor's Remorse, where Benny really dedicates a whole song to him still being here and all of his comrades back in Buffalo that are either dead or in jail. And it's a really personal, deep record. BSF artist Rick Hyde is on it. But yeah, that album, I mean, Benny's streak of consistency. You and I had a headline. There's been no MC more consistent over the last 2 years than Benny the Butcher. And, that album is very much evident in that. And the last LP on my top 10, there's a few that could have taken the spot. I listened to a lot of music the last 2 weeks, and I have to give it up based on my listens. And it goes to Breeze Bruin with his album Hindsight. And people may know Breeze. I mean, he was the primary MC on Prince Paul's Prince Among Thieves back in '99, the front man of the Juggernauts with his two siblings, Buddy Slim and Queen Heroin. This album is really important to me. It's a very personal album. I'm not the first writer to use this analogy, but Breeze raps like he raps in cursive. It's very scribbly. He's got a really unique style of delivery and flow, and it shines on here. It's probably an acquired taste, but there's really personal records on here. He has a joint called The Uninvited, and I still haven't figured out who he's referring to. At times, I think it might even be DMX, but he talks about growing up and another MC that he came up with who goes on these big tours, and they had this pact, sort of like Eminem with D12 of like, yo, you get on, you come back for me. And that didn't happen. And instead of being bitter about it, Breeze celebrates his friend and just kind of looks at it as a lump in the game. He has another song called Taking Notes, which he talks about, his life as a teacher in the Bronx, like literally teaching impressionable minds, and how he tries to help these kids get to a better place. I was one of the front runners in 2005 that really got behind Sean Price's Monkey Bars album, which was Sean, again, being super personal. It was kind of a Hail Mary pass in a career when, as Sean has said, like he very nearly walked away from rap and went and did something else with his life. And he made music that was so personal and so meaningful and so good that people got around it. And Breeze has always been an elite MC to me, did a lot of great stuff with the Weathermen and Company Flow and Indelible MCs. And this album, it went under the radar of many, but it's a truly, truly great album. I've sent you a lot of songs from it over the year, and I'd be remiss if I didn't put it in my top 10.
Word. That's dope. That's dope. I haven't listened to that one. I'm going to definitely check that out. I'm going to download and listen to it today, actually. So,
Word.
I had a few honorable mentions, some of which are in yours. So Arm & Hammer for sure, Haram and Crisis, the Hour of Chaos. Some that didn't make it, and some will probably make it on yours. Honorable mentions too is so Ransom and Rome Streets, Coup de Grace, AZ's Do or Die 2, yeah. Joell Ortiz Autograph, and easily mine could have been a top 20. We just decided to do top 10. Some soundtracks, The Harder They Fall, I think was a great one. Judas and the Black Messiah also, star-studded. One that was in heavy rotation for our playlist. And then a couple of ones that probably might be surprising to people. But one is Donda. I think that the more that I listen to Donda, there are at least 10 songs that I think are incredibly strong. I think, again, this is one that if it was culled to like even 15, 17 songs, may have made my top 10, but 28 songs or whatever it is now, 31. It's a lot to get through, and I do think it loses a little bit of steam. And another is Migos Culture 3. That's an album that the first 5 or 6 joints, like just unstoppable for me. Having songs like Avalanche, where they do the Temptations. One
of the best beats of the year.
It's incredible, and they kill it. The joint with Drake too is amazing too. So the Migos Culture 3 is kind of rounds out my honorable mentions for this year.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned Westside Gun, and especially Sincerely.
Oh, sorry, and Benny also.
Word.
Yeah.
that, side A, especially the Russ album, easily could have been if this was a 20 list. Donda as well. Just in quick, you say Migos, and I know there's people that listen to our podcast or follow the site that may or may not be Migos fans or see that as a stretch for us. You've kept that on the playlist. I love that song. The minute you sent it to me, I played it 10 times. I think Young Thug made a great album in punk, straight up. Like, to me, I've heard a lot over the years of Young Thug's merits, and I really see him in full form on punk. A lot of people that I've spoken to this year, and I know it's Grammy nominated, with Tyler the Creator's Call Me If You Get Lost. That would, if this was a list of 20, that would 100% be on it. The only other things that I think are worth mentioning for me are three kind of beat albums. Production and beat culture is part of hip hop. Madlib, and we included in our mid-year list, but Sound Ancestors, great joint. Similarly, and I really struggle with, it doesn't have the kind of breakbeat feel of a Madlib, but Flying Lotus with Yasuki, he has Denzel Curry rap on the album, but it's more electro, kind of spatial. I mean, Flying Lotus has always been in a class of his own, but that was one of my most listened to albums this year, and I think a case could be made that it is hip hop. And then lastly, Damu the Fudge Monk, a true OG in beat culture, put out a joint called Conversation Piece, which has Blue and Nitty Scott and Raw Poetics rapping on it. And that's one I keep coming back to too as an honorable mention. So for sure. And, overall, just what an interesting year for music, kind of unlike a lot of others, really.
Word, for sure. A really great year. I think last year was a great one too. And last year was one where we saw the Grammys recognizing those albums that we love and our community loves too. So I think music is in a good place and continuing to open up the aperture, which is great. So one last thing before we wrap on the news front is kind of a subplot to this whole Kanye Drink Champs interview. So Kanye was on there, and in addition to talking about Drake, he had a lot of pointed words about Big Sean, good music signee. He was asked what was his biggest regret, I think musically or whatever, or signing, and he said Big Sean was his biggest regret, and he said it was because Sean was disloyal and abandoned him when he ran for president and when he decided to endorse Trump. But said some really sharp things. And so Sean was on Drink Champs, premiered yesterday or Friday. It wasn't in response to it. He was initially supposed to be on, and just it so happened that the Kanye thing happened first. But it was a really incredible listen, 3 hours long, as are most Drink Champs. It took like 40 minutes or so in before they even started drinking heavily. It seemed like Sean was not going to do that. His publicist, he was there to be a second set of eyes and ears. But then at the 1 hour and 46 mark, it gets super real, and he responds to Kanye's allegations and goes in depth about the business dealings they have and how he thinks the most loyal person on good music. He stayed with him, did 5 albums with him. But he says that he's owed, and the numbers I've seen are $6 million. And Sean said $6 million at 1.2, but kind of, backtracks on that a little bit. But in any case, it's millions of dollars. And he's like, yo, if, this dude is worth billions, and, Kanye on that Drink Champ was saying he's worth $9 billion or something like that. And he just owes me some M's. Like, don't you think it's the right thing for him to do? And he said that he had gone to Universal thinking it was Vivendi and Universal holding back the money, but it became clear through an audit that the money had been
cost
paid.
Sean 6 figures. Yeah.
Yeah, that the money had been paid to Good Music, which is Kanye's imprint, and it just never made its way to Big Sean. Now, with record contracts, especially, and Big Sean said this, his manager Jay Brown, who's very high in Rock Nation and very close to Jay-Z, has said this is the worst contract he's ever seen. And, Jay Brown's been in the business for a long time. So for that to be the case, it must be extra horrific, because generally speaking, at their foundation record company agreements are terrible. But the ones that are the worst are the ones that are kind of production company, which is, it's the mid-level agreement. So typically an artist will sign directly to the record label, but sometimes they'll sign to a production company that then signs to the record label, which means there's a middleman taking a piece of your percentage. So if a typical artist will get 12 to 14% of royalties, under a production deal, you could get 6 to 8%, something like that. So you're really taking a huge hit. And then, not to get too technical into it, but all the stuff that comes out for a record. So music videos, a recording budget, like sometimes touring, all those things are taken out of the artist's money, but it's not off the top. It's not all the money that comes in for the record. Instead, you're recouping those costs through your percentage of the royalty. So if there's $100,000 in costs and the record generates $1 million in revenue, let's say that the person gets 6% of that, so $60,000. They still owe $40,000 technically, even though the record company has made $900,000.
Right.
So those economics are insane, but that's the way the music business works. And so it's very possible that even though Big Sean generated 30 million, 40, $50 million, whatever it was, that because of the construct of his agreement, he still technically owes the label money. But I don't know, maybe his audit factors all that in and he still is owed $6 million. And if that's the case, then it's really crazy that he didn't receive that fund. But Sean is very factual. Well, he's very honest, very revealing and very detailed and very convincing, in my opinion, that what he's saying is true. But what was your takeaway from it?
Yeah, I thought the loyalty point was just so interesting. I mean, he compares himself to Kid Cudi, which is timely, right? Because Cudi is, very much in cahoots again with Kanye, at least on Donda
and Drake.
And Drake's album, yeah. And Big Sean makes perhaps a larger point at that point in the discussion. It comes maybe 40 minutes later of some tensions back in the day when Sean had Drake and they had their own relationship on Dark Sky. What was it? Dark Sky Paradise?
Exactly. On Blessings. The song Blessings.
And I thought Sean made a really good point for himself. And he really has been, what perhaps Meek Mill has been to MMG. He has been the dedicated person to good. And I thought about it. Like, I even looked, I was like, a lot of people think that 2 Chainz is a good music artist. 2 Chainz has always been a Def Jam artist. He's just been an affiliate, of good. And Common was there for a minute and then moved on to Common's things. Cudi was there for a minute, moved on to Cudi's things. And Sean, in a lot of ways, seems to be feeling the wrath of something that he didn't do. And it made a great case. I really liked the way that he handled himself in that interview. And early on at that conversation, Nori made the point of like, yo, we talk about Kendrick, Cole, Drake, maybe he said Travis too. There's this elite class. And truly, Sean is deserving of being included in that. And if you look at the numbers, if you look at what's accomplished, it's hard to dispute that. And Sean very much popped on the scene around that same time and has done so much with his career. So I watched about an hour of that. I saw that it was over 3 hours long. I do want to catch the rest of it, but it's very interesting. And I would hope that Kanye addresses that. I've heard grumblings that after the Drink Champs, Beanie Siegel and Freeway posted this thing on Instagram of Beanie with a large sum of cash money. And it was kind of wink, wink, nod, nod that maybe Kanye paid him out for giving him the Yeezy name and really created a deal of revenue for Beans. I would hope that if that's the case, Kanye, who doesn't seem short of cash in any way, shape, or form right now, does right by Sean. Because I think that would be another thing that looks good in hip hop when we've seen so many contract disputes get ugly.
Although, interestingly, I saw a headline this weekend saying that Kanye believes he'll be broke in 5 years because he's converting all his properties into churches. So who knows? Who knows what the actual financial state is, But yeah, that's an incredible shout out to Drink Champs, man. They've had some great interviews this year. So new music. You want to talk new music of the week?
Yeah, I'll just give a shout out to a couple of songs. I sent it to you and you added it to the playlist. Shout out to the Cool Kids. It came out 3 weeks ago. But they did a new song with Larry June called All or Nothing. And it's got, it's got kind of an homage to Dre and the beat. And, the Cool Kids were pioneers of so much of what transpired in the mid 2010s. I almost feel sometimes they were on the scene too early and didn't get to see some of the benefit of their style choices, of their nostalgia, of their forward thinking. I mean, they were a really cool package, Chuck English and Sir Mikey Rocks. And to have them come back with a really dope record, that moved me. And they have an album coming in early 2022. We may have them on the show. Also, RZA put out a 2-pack with the Flatbush Zombies. RZA is credited as a producer on both songs, co-producer. The first one was called Plug Addicts. Full disclosure, wasn't 100% my joint, but they put one out this weekend called Quentin Tarantino, which, as you may recall, is RZA's boy, and that one goes like, it's a co-production, but it's a really, really good beat, and it's a cool, you and I spend a lot of time talking about, breaking the generation gap. I mean, Flatbush Zombies, you got two kind of Brooklyn representatives. I know RZA has a foot in Staten Island and a foot in Brooklyn, but coming, 25 years apart and making a really dope jam. So I like seeing that. I had sent you a song called Never at Peace by the Career Cooks, which is shout out to Philly, Zilla Rocca, and Small Professor, two really good guys. And I really have enjoyed that album. Just good MC producer duo. I think this is their second album. And then lastly, we've mentioned both on this podcast, but yesterday, very low key, Alchemist put out a new album with Boldy James called Super Tecmo Bo. And Boldy's been on a prolific tear. He's down with Griselda, does some of his best work with Alchemist. I played that once through, but really need to sit with it. But have you checked out any of those? Any new music you want to add?
I have not. I just downloaded the Boldy and Alchemist, so I didn't know that was out. And I did download Breeze Brewing. I'll just add the last thing is the contract, which we talked about, Dr. Dre.
For sure.
That is within the Grand Theft Auto game, but quick YouTube search, you can find like the entire thing, and that's really, really high quality music. So
yeah, or even an AFH search, you might catch it. So I want to ask you two questions. You got a song of the week, and then we may not do another podcast depending on what happens. So I'm curious, do you have a song of the year?
So song of the week is ETA from that contract, the Grand Theft Auto. It's Dr. Dre featuring Anderson .Paak, Snoop Dogg, and Busta Rhymes. Incredible, real soulful, and the interplay between the MCs harkens back to like the Run DMC days, and with the call and response kind of thing, which is dope. Song of the year, that's a tough one. As I mentioned earlier. I think that Stellar Ray Theory by Mach-Hommy is a joint that I've played over and over and over again. But I would say that the song I probably wore out this year beyond that was My Life. J. Cole with 21 Savage and Moray. That joint is incredible to me, and so off the top, that would probably be it. How about you?
Word. Yeah, for the week, I'll just give it up to the Cool Kids and Larry June. I keep coming back to that. Great production, great interplay. For the year, it's my most played song, according again to the DSPs. All of that said, by Evidence and Boldy James, it's just one highlight. I could go with 2 or 3 different songs on Ev's album, but I love the way those two guys from different worlds come together, and very easily my song of the year in terms of what it says, and also it was just my soundtrack. So
word. Well, happy holidays, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in this year. Jake and I do this for the love. We're really glad that there are other people who enjoy it. We continue to celebrate you. Wish everyone a safe and peaceful end to this year, and hope that there are no more losses. Unfortunately, we tend to see that a lot this time of year, but many things to be grateful for. So thank you,
man. Thank you all. Yeah. And until we do it again, man.
Word. All right. Peace, man.